So I was too young to know about this, but I learned about it recently, that there was a popular TV game show in the 1950s called 21. Anyone remember that? Really? Okay, fine. So apparently, it was hosted by Jack Barry, and there were two contestants who competed against each other in separate, isolated booths, answering questions that would earn them up to 21 points. But in 1959, the top contestant, Charles Van Doren, an American writer, testified before Congress that the show was rigged. He had been given the answers to the show by the producers to manufacture drama and maintain ratings. So when the truth came out, apparently, America was scandalized, and Van Doren was ruined. He was dropped by NBC, and he resigned from his post as an English instructor at Columbia University. He admitted, quote, that he would have given almost anything to have reversed the course of his life. He spent the remainder of his 93 years living quietly in a Connecticut home. Those were the days when shame was a powerful social corrective. Nowadays, I'm concerned with the annihilation of shame. Shame needs two ingredients: self-reproach and public outcry. In order for shame to yield any power, we need to feel a sense of remorse, accompanied by communal judgment. But nowadays, I see the opposite. Sometimes we rationalize our actions to distance ourselves from potential shame. Think of the ICE agents who say, "I was just carrying out my job at the border," as they tear children from their parents' arms. Or when we snap at a loved one because she criticized us, so we can be mean back. Or when we explain away our deception and say, well, whatever, our marriage was over anyway, so we're really not doing anything wrong. Sometimes we pretend to be clueless and ignore our shame. Think of Bill Cosby and the 60 women who accused him of drugging and molesting them, or all the other stories that began to surface in the wake of the Me Too movement about people in power abusing those with less. Or when we're oblivious to the psychological harm we cause our children, when we focus on how they can do better, unaware of the pressure we're causing them. And sometimes we just want to get ahead, and we hope that we won't be found out. Think of the parents, college counselors, and coaches in the college admission bribery scandal who paid tens of millions of dollars to inflate entrance exam test scores and bribe college officials. We seem to live in a culture that even when caught, lacks shame. Personally, I come from a Persian Jewish culture, and I know shame. One of my uncles had cancer, and I was told, don't talk about it. He still has unmarried children in the family, and other families won't want to marry into our family if they find out he has cancer. Then I had a cousin who had a child with autism, and I tried to show my support by recognizing that it must be challenging to raise this child, and my cousin looked at me like I was crazy. And I thought, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she doesn't have a special needs kid. It was only years later when someone else in the family explained to me that it wasn't something we talk about. And when other relatives were thinking about divorce or marrying a Muslim woman, holy cow, don't even go there. The shame of the entire extended family, if either one would have happened, would be a disaster. It's interesting that the first emotion the Torah references is shame. Adam and Eve are in the garden and they're naked, and the Torah clearly says that they're not ashamed. Nice. We Jews don't find sexuality and nudity to be something shameful about. But then they eat the forbidden fruit. Adam blames Eve, even though they both ate it, and then they hide. They hide their naked bodies by covering up, and they hide from God because they think they can. And now, after eating the forbidden fruit, doing something they know they shouldn't have done, they feel shame. Later, the first murder takes place in the Torah. Cain kills his brother Abel, and God tells Cain, your brother's blood is crying out for you. Cain doesn't express any remorse, and as punishment for showing no shame, God marks Cain and sentences him to be a fugitive and wanderer. So in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve realize they did something wrong and feel ashamed, but Cain doesn't own the horror of his actions, and God has to teach him shame. Then think about Joseph and his 11 brothers. They feel deep shame. After years of being jealous of their father's close relationship to their brother Joseph, they plot to kill him. Instead, they hold back and sell him to the Ishmaelites, but when they get home, they show their dad Joseph's bloody coat, leading him to believe that his favorite son has died. 20 years pass, and they never come clean. Their dad enters old age thinking that his favorite son is dead. But then, due to a famine in Israel, the brothers go down to Egypt where there's food. They approach the second in command, and they beg for sustenance. Joseph immediately recognizes his brothers, but they don't know that it's Joseph. And after Joseph can't take it any longer, he bursts out in sobs, and the brothers learn that the second in command is their brother Joseph. And the Torah says the brothers' shame of selling Joseph and never telling their dad the truth rushes back to them, and they fear for their lives. A little shame did Joseph's brothers a lot of good. Their personal and public humiliation is raw and filled with dread. It motivated them to do tshuva, to transform their relationships. And the question for us is, can shame motivate us to change? The rabbis of the Talmud teach that there are 3 signs that someone has a Jewish neshama, a Jewish essence. One is shame, and the other 2 are showing acts of kindness and compassion. They also teach that when someone injures another person, they're liable for 5 categories, the things we would normally think of: damages, pain, health care, unemployment, and the 5th is shame. It's fascinating to think that the rabbis considered shame to be a positive quality to nurture, something that hints at a Jewish essence, as well as being a category that needs to be repaired when we cause harm. Shame is this unspoken theme of our high holiday season. Think about what we do between the 10 days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We constantly review and recount our missteps. Not because we don't believe in ourselves, not because we're horrible people, but in fact, the opposite is true. We come together every year to review our year and put ourselves back on course because we do believe in ourselves. We know we're human. We know we've made mistakes. We've hurt those we've loved. We've ignored our obligations to family members. We've perhaps slacked off in our friendships. We've acted unethically, maybe. And with that shame, we show up, we admit our shortcomings, and honestly try to work toward renewing our lives. And yet, you must be thinking, shame can be very dicey and even paralyzing. For example, we've heard the most compelling call in our country to talk about race. Brené Brown, a psychologist and leading researcher on shame, teaches that we can't talk about race without talking about shame, because we can't talk about race without talking about privilege. And when we start talking about privilege, we get paralyzed by shame. And it's not just shame around race that paralyzes us. Every year, someone from the Temple Israel community confides in me that they're struggling financially, that they have high expenses because of a child in need, a parent's illness, a job loss, or just trying to make ends meet. And I tell them that we never turn anyone away due to finances. Just let our executive director know what you can afford monthly. We'll make it work. But then they shake their head and say, I just can't. I can't ask for help again. Or, I don't feel right asking for help. It's not like I live in poverty. And I look them straight in the eye and I say, I was a scholarship kid my entire childhood and young adulthood. My synagogue paid for everything for me. They paid for my religious school, for youth group, for my religious school trips and retreats. And then when I went to rabbinical school, my rabbi found me an anonymous angel, someone who to this day I have no idea who this person is. And he helped me pay for rabbinical school. And look at me today. I'm a rabbi. And so I say, maybe your kid will be a rabbi in 20 years at Temple Israel. And I assume that if I'm self-revealing, that if I really put my heart out on the table and tell them about my own family's dependence on financial aid, that they'll feel validated and comfortable to ask for help. But shame runs deep and sometimes prevails. And then there's the shame that haunts survivors of suicide. Peggy Wermeyer, a widow after her husband killed himself, reminds us that 45,000 Americans died just last year from suicide in a staggering but seemingly silent epidemic. She reveals that the depression and the shame of losing a loved one to suicide doesn't go into the grave like cancer. Irrational shame haunts her. She wonders, what could I have done? Did I miss the signs? Wasn't our family's love enough for him? I've counseled many women who have been assaulted. No one walks away without feeling violated, and yet at the same time, a sense of shame often remains. I've heard stories of a grown woman raising children of her own who reflected back on when she was a trusting child and her grandfather fondled her, and the shame she still feels thinking about those memories. Or the businessman who recognizes that he was drugged and raped by 2 other men and the shame he holds in his heart. Or the college student who was attacked after hanging out at her university's bar, too drunk to remember the details and too scared to scream, and the shame that lingers and intrudes upon her current intimate relationships. Shame in the extreme can have devastating effects. The UN estimates that 5,000 women and girls are murdered worldwide each year in honor killings by members of their own family. And these happen because of a perception of shame being brought on the family by actions that often the family member can't even control. Amnesty International notes that honor killings also occur in LGBT family members, particularly gay men. So when I say that we should have a bit more shame in our lives, I recognize this is a dangerous request. Brené Brown reminds us that shame is highly correlated with addiction and depression, violence, aggression, bullying, suicide, and eating disorders, while guilt is inversely correlated with those things. So what's the difference between shame and guilt? Brown describes shame as the swampland of the soul. It's when we say, I'm not good enough, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not wealthy enough, I'm not skinny enough, I'm not smart enough. The feelings that we are inherently bad or a nothing. Shame is the focus on self. But guilt, according to Brown, is a focus on behavior. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is I did something bad. And yet, she says, that people who don't experience any shame have no capacity for connection or empathy. Which means, yes, I have a little bit of shame, or yes, I'm a sociopath. So I'd opt for a little shame. Bryan Stevenson also believes we need to increase the shame index in America. He's the founder and executive director of Equal Justice Initiative. Stevenson works tirelessly as a lawyer and activist addressing the wrongs our country perpetrated regarding slavery and its aftermath. Author of the powerful book Just Mercy and winner of a MacArthur Genius Award, he recently built the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, also called the Lynching Memorial, in Montgomery, Alabama. It documents America's brutal history on domestic slave trade, racial terrorism, Jim Crow South, and the world's largest prison system, which is ours. Stevenson says it like it is. He reminds us how shameful it is to think that until now, there has been no national memorial acknowledging the victims of racial terror in the United States. Contrast that with other nations. You can't go anywhere in Berlin today without encountering a monument or literally tripping over brass stones in front of buildings where Jews were deported under the Nazis. And in Rwanda, I've heard you are required to hear about the genocide. You can't spend a few days there without someone talking to you about the damage and despair and hurt and pain created by that horror. In the Genocide Museum there, they actually have human skulls. That's how powerfully people want to express their guilt. But in this country, in the United States, up until relatively recently, we haven't been talking about slavery. We haven't talked about lynching. Worse, we've created this counter narrative that says, oh, we don't have anything to be ashamed about. Our past is romantic and glorious. And he believes we need to rehabilitate shame. Using the metaphor of a long-term relationship, Stevenson says, you show me two people who have been in love for 50 years, and I'll show you two people who have learned how to apologize to one another when they hurt each other. That is a stronger union. So how can we as individuals and as a country restore some of our shame? Not to paralyze us, but to move us toward tshuva, toward reflection, owning our wrong, taking responsibility for our actions, and moving toward repair. How can we be more sensitive to our shame? So the sins we'll read on Yom Kippur in 10 days aren't just words, but they really weigh down on our soul. The first step is to feel the weight of our shame, to allow ourselves to sit with that discomfort. At the lynching memorial in Alabama, Stevenson constructed over 800 Corten steel monuments with the names of the lynching victims engraved on every column that literally hang over people's heads when they walk through the site. Each of the 800 columns represents a county in the United States where racial terror and lynching took place. The columns hang over our heads like nooses hung above a black man's neck before lynching. I'm not an advocate of humiliation. In fact, Stevenson explains beautifully that one of the reasons he thinks that we struggle so much with confronting our failures is that we've created such a punitive society. Stevenson doesn't want to punish this country for these decades of abuse. He wants to liberate us. So when done right, imagine shame liberating you. Take a moment, there's no sharing, and focus on one chet, one sin, one place where you feel short of who you want to be. It might be a moment, a conversation, a relationship that elicits a feeling of shame within you. And now imagine feeling the weight of the pain of who you hurt on your shoulders. Feel the repercussions of your actions and words, and sit with that shame. And now imagine your way out, not by brushing it aside or berating yourself, but by holding your shame with delicate hands, owning it with honesty and compassion, working toward repairing the damage. How would you hold your body differently with the person that you hurt? How would you speak differently to that individual? And if the first step toward increasing a healthy sense of shame for ourselves is sitting with our mistakes and acknowledging the damage we've done, the next step is trying to repair the pain. There's a great story in the Talmud. Rabbi Elazar, he had just come home from an intense day of learning at his teacher's home, and he was all puffed up and felt so good about how smart he was and how much Torah he had learned that day. And suddenly, as he's walking home, he saw a really ugly guy. And this ugly stranger looked at him and said, "Greetings to you, my rabbi." And Rabbi Elazar didn't return his greeting. Instead, Rabbi Elazar said to him one word, "Reka," which means ugly, empty, worthless vessel. And then he didn't stop. The rabbi said, "Are all the people in your city as ugly as you are?" And apparently the man held his cool and simply responded, "I don't know, but I suggest you go to my craftsman who made me and tell God how ugly is the vessel you made." When Rabbi Elazar realized that he had sinned and insulted the man merely on account of his appearance, he got off his donkey, prostrated himself before the man, and begged for forgiveness. But the man shook his head. "I'm sorry, I can't forgive you. You insulted my craftsman. Go to my craftsman who made me and say how ugly is the vessel you made." And Rabbi Elazar was bereft. What did he do? The whole way home, Rabbi Elazar walked behind this man, and he wouldn't stop asking for forgiveness. And they reached Rabbi Elazar's village, and of course, since Rabbi Elazar was this great man, all the townspeople came out and greeted him and welcomed him home. They shouted, "Greetings to you, our great rabbi, our master." And the man looked around. Shocked, he said, "Who you calling great rabbi?" And they said, "Well, don't you know who's walking behind you? It's our rabbi." And he said, "If this guy's a rabbi, I hope there aren't a lot more like him amongst the Jews." What? They couldn't believe their ears. "What are you talking about? Rabbi Elazar, he's a great man." And then the man told everyone, what Rabbi Elazar did to him. And now the community begged for this man's forgiveness. And this time, the man agreed, but on one condition, that the rabbi stop behaving this way to anyone else in the future. And immediately, Rabbi Elazar ran to the Beit Midrash, the house of study, and in front of his own students, he told this story that I just told you, which is why we have it today. Imagine the shame Rabbi Elazar felt admitting that he, supposedly a great leader in his community, acted so basely. And the guts it took for him to tell this story about himself. We can find the courage to tell similar stories about ourselves, to hold a healthy bit of shame in order to make a change. My blessing for all of us in this new year is that we emulate Rabbi Elazar and not Cain. That we spend the next 10 years examining our deeds and actions, not to berate ourselves, but to recreate ourselves. And that we find time to sit with our discomfort, to feel the weight of it hanging over our heads, not to make us hide even more, but to liberate us and to set us free. Amen.